Hey, this is Jim from Jim's Garage Adventures. Um, Always wanted to do a series on how to do LS1 swaps. So I have probably about 3.5, 4 years of experience doing LS1 swaps. I've done about 4 to 6 complete conversions, and total of those conversions and engine starts I've done about 11. So I've done my own wiring harnesses, bought the software to do the ECU changes, all of that information. So I actually wanted, this is now December 8th, 2017. I bought my first engine back in 2007. Um, Started doing the research and then got lost and confused and thought I couldn't do it and ended up selling everything. So about 4 years ago, I bought another one, a little 5.3, and then I educated myself because back in 2007, I just couldn't find enough information. So now that I've learned a lot about YouTube and watched a lot on YouTube and did a lot of research myself, there's a lot of information out there today on how to do this. But one thing that I haven't been able to find really well is a good guide on doing your own engine swaps. And the biggest thing that people were concerned about is doing your own wiring harnesses. So I want to do a step-by-step series on how to go from finding an engine, what to get, all the way through your first start. So let's get started. So my wife says I do have a bit of a problem now because whenever I find these, either in vehicles, I have friends now that call me after 4 years and say, hey, I've got one. So that's what this was, is a guy bought a 2000, probably 1, 2, 3 Tahoe that was wrecked, and he bought it for the transmission. And he said, hey, Bo, come over, you pull the motor out, help me get the transmission out. I paid $600 for it. You give me $500. It's $100 for my transmission. So this is what I usually get these for. Is the cheapest I spent was my very first one, which was $500 delivered from eBay. And that one's been in a vehicle 3.5 years now. This is a little 5.3 I picked up about 2 months ago. Again, $800 for a 5.3 with decent mileage. I consider decent mileage under 140. I've got them all the way up to probably at 200,000 miles. They're going to run forever as long as you take care of them. So this one has some of the components removed. Those are in the box, but I don't get too concerned about what I have and don't have because if I go to a pull apart place and see when it's wrecked and I don't want the motor, I'll pull coils, coil packs, ECUs, throttle bodies, or whatever I can get for them. So this one over here, I bought a complete truck for $1,100 and have sold everything off from it. So I think that motor, I'm $200 to the positive in my pocket. So I think I've made $1,300 or $1,500 off from everything else. So that's a little 191,000 mile motor that I actually drove in the vehicle. So I know that it's really good. And down at my other shop, I have probably 4 more on a shelf. So this is the motor I'm getting everything prepared for. If I remember correctly, it was in a truck that was rolled. It's got 191,000 miles on it. Took it in on trade for some swap work that I did, so I know it works, know it runs. It is on my engine test stand, which right now is buried in the back of my shop, so you won't be able to see it. But when we get to that stage, I'll show you how I actually run and start these and do all the testing and everything right on my little engine test stand that I made. We've probably had 5 or 6 motors on here, and it works really well. So this is what the wiring harness is for. So where I picked up about 90% of my information and where I did a lot of my research was LS1 Tech. It's a forum, and everybody sent us to LT1 Swap. So if you go to the website www.lt1swap.com, I think the gentleman that put this together, his name is Brandon. It's kind of like a Bible. Anything and everything that you need to know is through this. I've talked to the guy a couple times. He is a great person to work with, and he's also out there to, pass on what he's learned, and also has a side business on the side doing that. So what I've found is everything you need is right here on these pages. So if you go into the wire harness information and you look at Vortec 4853 and 60 from 2000 to 2007, here's everything you need to know. And one of the most important things you need to know is wiring harness schematics, So everything from the wiring harness schematics is here, and I'll show you how to use those in a minute. And the other thing that is really important is these pinouts. So I'll show you this in a little bit. He's put together a very nice list for each of the connectors, the C1 blue and the C2 red, what stays, what is used, and what is not used. And it's invaluable putting these together. Once you understand this, anybody can do it. So we have our first snow today. Again, it's December 8th, 2017 in Rutherford County, North Carolina. So my other two projects I'm working on right now, I'm waiting parts on, so I figured I'd go ahead and start this series. So what we're working on is a 2000 to 2003 drive-by cable motor. So it's a little bit simpler. It's a good one to start with. You're not going to have cruise control, but I will do a little subsection if you want to do one that you've already got drive-by wire. If you get a drive-by wire one, it doesn't take but another half hour and you've got cruise control. So, what to look for? A lot of the drive-by wire ones and the 2000 to 2003s, all the drive-by cable, all the drive-by cable ones have a red and a blue. So C1 is blue and C2 is red. Those actually go into the ECU. So for a drive-by cable, wiring harness, and motor, you want to get everything you possibly can. A lot of times, 3-4 years ago, you could get the complete motor with starter and alternator. And if you go look right now, I've seen them between $60 and $150 just for the starter. Alternators, $120, $130 at your parts store. So the more complete motor you can get, the better. Wiring harness is imperative that you get that, because if you go to aftermarket, you're looking $800 and up, or some local guys are doing them for $600-700. But you can do it yourself. I taught myself, and I've showed a couple friends how to do it. So now I want to be able to pass on what I've learned the last couple of years from the people that have gone out and taught people on the internet. I want to show them how I do it in a little different take that I have. So one thing that I make sure I do get is the positive and negative battery cables. It's really nice because you have this junction box that you can go ahead and jump start it. If you're not going to use this, like I've done a couple of remote batteries, you can cut this off, but it's really nice to have that. Cleans up the engine compartment, makes things a lot easier to do. So here's the basic information that I would just pull up and start looking at to get yourself familiar with, whether you have an engine or not. It's very, very handy, and it is basically the Bible to get you from what to find, what to pull up, through getting your engine started at the first time. So this is all the information that you'll need to take your wiring harness apart and make sure that you get it back together correctly. So the first one is that sheet that Brandon has on LS1Swap.com. It shows you every pinout, which I'll show you here in a minute, what wire goes there and what it's for. So there's one for the blue connector and there's one for the red connector. And then what I did is also print out the schematic for that. So this one, the upper left hand corner, that's a crankshaft position sensor, which we'll go over, the camshaft position sensor, and then the knock sensors. So this shows you that for the camshaft position sensor, there's 3 wires that come out of that. One's brown and white, one's pink and black, and one is red. So the brown and white wire go to C1 and 73. And then the pink and black C161, red directly from the camshaft position sensor to the ECU is C239. So once you look at that and you start understanding that it's just connecting one wire from the next, if you look at the whole wiring harness, there's 160 different places for pins, and it looks like a rat's nest. That can get you put you off at the very beginning. But if you look at it by each system or by each sensor at a time, it becomes very, very simple. And I'll show you how I do that. So what I'm going to show you is this is the camshaft position sensor. It has a little damage. This is how I got it. But believe it or not, I will still use this because I will cut the wires and solder them all back together. So just wanted to show you that that is the camshaft position sensor plug. And what we're going to do is we're going to separate this from here all the way back to C1 and C2 and bring those into their own wire bundle themselves. And I'll explain that here in a minute. But you can see brown and white wire that goes from the A terminal, which you can see here, that will end up on C172. The B, which is pink and black, goes from C1 to C142. And in the red is going to go to C239. So the first thing you want to do once you get your wiring harness, clean it. Because these motors are known for leaky valve cover gaskets. So I always just wipe them down, try to get them as clean as possible, because the tape is going to get you dirty, let alone having oil and dirt and everything else all over it. So just to make sure you have everything, clean it up really good, and then start taking it all apart. So you're going to want to remove all of the wire protector, and then once you get that done, just cut all of the tape off. So when I get ready to start working on a wiring harness to do the initial stripping, I usually start with like 3 tools. Give me a set of side cutters to remove the zip ties, a little screwdriver to pop these plastic clamps off that hold the wiring harness to just about everything, and I get a box cutter with put in a fresh nice blade so I can start stripping all the tape off. So I always like to start by preparing the first area, which is where C1 and C2, where these connectors are. So the first thing I usually like to do is get everything prepared, remove all the tape and the protector from the areas where the two C1 and C2 blue and red connectors are. And one thing I noticed on this harness, which you may find out, and is not a big deal, but you want to watch as you start taking this apart, is there are broken wires, which happens. A lot of these come from wrecks. Broken wires, and also wires that have splits in the wire. Now that is not a big deal, and the way I take these apart, I will show you, is that when I take each wire apart, I actually do a continuity test on each wire from the terminal connector plug itself back to the terminal that goes into the ECU. And also I inspect each wire when I pull it out as a bundle of 1, 2, 3, or 15 to make sure each one of the wires is good. Because something like this, people would get all concerned about, but once you find that mating wire, strip it back, solder it together, and tape it, it'll work fine. My personal vehicle, that was the first one that I actually converted, probably 30-40% of the wires in that harness right now are soldered together, and the car's got over 15,000 miles on it. Runs like a top. I've not had a problem. So if you do see this, don't flip out. It's easily fixed, or you can actually get some new wire, or what I do is I actually, if I buy a whole vehicle, I take the whole wiring harness and I'll pull out wires. If the wire is really bad, I'll just put new terminals on each end or solder a new piece in, and it'll work fine. So the first thing I'll do on this terminal itself for the C1 blue is remove these blue alignment plugs. So these have locators on them that locate this plug to the ECU to make sure all the terminals line up and everything else to the pins inside the ECU. So what you want to do is go in here with a small screwdriver and push the pin on the inside and lift it up, and then go on the outside, push the little tab in inside, and pull this off. set that aside for future use. And one more thing that I like to do is I'll actually mark with a Sharpie right on this terminal block so that I know C1 blue and C2 red. Now they're the exact same part number, I'm pretty sure, but when you go back to put wires together, put wires back in these, you're going to have two different blocks. You're not going to have the plastic terminal locators on them yet because you can't put the pins in. So this just gives you something easy to check back on and make sure you're putting the wires back in the right place. The next step I do is before I start taking any wires off or out of the terminals, I will go and check with my reference sheet and make sure that in pin number 1 on C1 blue, they're numbered on the back. So you can see, you'll see on yours, but they're very small. C1 number 1 terminal has a black and white wire. So I verify that yep, it's a black and white wire, and I'll go through that for every single terminal to make sure that the wire colors match up. Now they don't usually change them, but just to make sure that you have what's supposed to be in there, then you can go ahead and pull all these out if you want to. It makes it a lot easier to pull them out, but how you take them apart is it's up to you, but then you'll know when you start it out that everything is correct. And another little tip that I've done for myself is that I use a computer a lot in the shop, and I like Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets. I've actually created this myself. So I've taken what Brandon's done here and created 2 tabs on an Excel or whatever worksheet, put the colors in, and then what I do is in separate cells next to it, I'll put down either a check mark or something else in columns that I've removed it, that I've checked continuity, that I've lengthened it, that I've put it back in the terminal harness. And because with all these sensors and these sensor wires, you can kind of get lost of what you've done and what you've not done. So if you come back a week later, a month later, you know what's done and what's not done. So it's just a little tip. So the next group of terminals after the ECU terminals are for fuse box, connections to the body ECU, things like that. So if you look on LS1 Swap's site, he talks about these, and one of the first things he says is you can just chop these right off, that you'll never use them. All of your pink wires that we'll talk about later, this is pink as soon as you turn the ignition on, and you get very, very familiar with these. When the ignition is on, all these pink wires are hot. So you can go ahead and cut these now, or you can cut them as you pull each terminal through. So that's completely up to you. I just wanted to give you an idea of what these next set of terminals are for. After about 45 minutes, got most of the covering off, most of the untaping done, and this is where all my friends and everybody go, you gotta be nuts. There's all this wire and what does it do? And I just get confused. Well, I'm going to show you. It's pretty easy, and what you think about it is, let's go back to the sheet here and let's look at the camshaft position sensor. So let's just focus on that circuit itself. Let's go find that plug and we'll pull it all the way back through the system, and I'll show you what I do. So like we looked earlier, the camshaft position sensor has had better days, but we can fix it and revive it. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull those wires, go all the way through to C2 and C1, and disconnect those so we have a bundle just for that circuit. So what I've done is I've chased that one wire, so red. So cam position sensor red is on C239. So I made sure that was the wire that goes all the way to that terminal. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and you pull this white tab back, and I don't know if I can do this with 2 fingers or not. Usually I push them through, then pull them back out. But you pull that wire terminal back a little bit and you push it down and you can pull that wire. Yep, not with one hand. Let's see if we can do this. my hand out of the way, you can pull that one wire right out. So that's C239. So there's the first wire, and I'll pull that one right back to the terminal. So now I've completely separated that circuit for the camshaft position sensor from the wiring harness, so it's completely separate. Now unfortunately this one's damaged, and I'll show you on the next one how I do it. But what I do then is the very next thing is I check each wire from this terminal back to the matching terminal. Make sure that you have continuity. So take your multimeter and set it on ohms, and you should see a 0 reading. That means that your wire is in good shape, that you are fully connected from this terminal to, say, that terminal. Then you want to go through and check the wires and make sure that you don't have any damage to the wire insulation coming off. If you have insulation coming off, you can shrink wrap that wire or put some tape over it. Just make sure that you don't have any of the wires damaged, because this is a very small, thin stranded wire. So I want to kind of cover my rationale on how I do the disassembly. So what I'll do is actually start with one of these pages, and I'll do each circuit individually. So I'll maybe grab the camshaft position sensor, do that one, do the crankshaft position sensor, and then do the knock sensors. Also, I'll mark those off on my Excel spreadsheet or on the sheet that Brandon created for us in LS1 Swap. The other thing I like to look at is I'll do all the ones that do not have a ground and all the circuits that don't have pinks, because that will thin the harness down pretty quickly, and you can get most of the sensor wires done that way pretty quickly, and I'll show you how to do that next. So this is the second circuit I've looked at, and this one actually has good wires on it, so I'll kind of show you a little bit what I do. This is the crankshaft position sensor. It's a 3-plug, and it plugs in behind the starter, and we'll kind of go over those locations when we start putting this back together. So I went ahead and separated the 3 wires. Those happen to be on C1, and pulled those all out. So I hope this will work. The first thing that I do is I check my multimeter, put it on ohms, make sure the leads are connected correctly, and check, yep, 0.3 ohms. And then what I want to do is find in the back of each one. So this one to the right is green, so I'll put one of my probes in there, and I'll check the other, and I have 0 ohms. So that way I know that green wire is good. And I'll do the same thing with the other ones. Yellow wire. Yellow wire is good. And the blue and white wire is also good. So the reasoning behind checking this is that once I have this circuit out of the wiring harness and I know that it's good, by checking the continuity across each pin, I know the wires are good. I'll check the wires to make sure there's no damage to them, and then I go and I tape. Basically from the plug, I'll take this off all the way down to about 6 or 8 inches from the end of these terminals that go into the ECU. The reason I do that is I'll put the ECU in the passenger compartment. I put them in the hump that's over the rear axle, and then what that allows me to do is that I can pull in each circuit individually. So I'll go and say, okay, now on my next checklist I'm going to hook up this, which is the camshaft position sensor. I'll plug that in to the camshaft position sensor, and I'll run just this wire bundle through a grommet in the firewall and connect it to the ECU. So once I know that is done, connected, then that circuit is done. You don't have to worry about all these other wires right now. This circuit's checked, this circuit's taped individually, and it's done. If you have a problem in the future, instead of having to take the entire harness back apart, you can take a couple zip ties off or however you hook them together and pull that one circuit out. It's all taped nicely. It's all taped neatly together, and it's very easy to work on. It's now time to take and pull everything for the automatic transmission. And it's quite a few wires, 10, 12, 14 wires, something like that. But there's one thing that you want to pay attention to before you pull the wires from the terminal block at the ECU. There are two, and I don't know why in their infinite wisdom General Motors did this, but there are two wires that are yellow and black. Now if you accidentally pull them out, you can check on the wiring diagrams and do a continuity check. I've done it. It takes a little bit of time because it's not easy to get inside. You have to stick a piece of wire in there, da-da-da-da-da. You can do it, but it's just as easy. Take a piece of Scotch tape or masking tape and mark those two wires. So before I pull those out, I'm going to mark them myself. Going through real quick and labeled those so I can pull them out. And also, it'll get you really confused. There's another yellow and black on C249, so that does not go with this harness for the transmission control. Just to show you a little thing you find sometimes is that when I was pulling these out, all the wires matched up, all the wire cards and everything else, but somewhere in this harness, and they're dull, so they've been broke for a while, but we have two broken wires for the transmission. I go back and look at what they're for, but it doesn't matter right now if they're attached, so I'll be able to probably end up shortening these anyway. But this is what you find from time to time, so that's why it's important to go through and do your continuity checks and also check to make sure you don't have broken wires or wires that have the insulation stripped off from them. There's one more thing I'd like to talk about when it comes to, of course I've already cut this out and got the harness off and everything else, is this is one of the coils. Hooks all four coil bank packs together for one bank, and within that you will have a ground, which is black, or sometimes they're black and white, and the pink, which is hot all the time. So this is what feeds all the coils on that bank 12 volts all the time. So this of course goes to the big connectors, which you can just go ahead and cut out. Now the black, or all the grounds, those go into, I almost call it a spider. There's multiple splices and multiple ground points. I tried to use that in my first car, and it caused nightmares because things were too short, things were too long. So what I finally got frustrated, and I cut all the grounds for the sensor wires. So for the coils, I think the mass airflow sensor, there might be a couple other ones that have a ground to the ground network or ground circuit. I cut those as long as possible right at the splices, because what I'll do is I'll put an individual eyelet on here, and then I'll run that directly to the back of the block. So there might be 6 or 8 wires at the back of the block, or wherever you want to ground them, that have their own grounds. So it maintains that system where these circuits for, say, the coils are their own individual bundle. Same thing with the pinks, is I'll probably extend this and I'll run it to a fuse panel, which we'll show later, have its own fuse, so that that individual pink is fed by itself, but also it is fused. So check my spreadsheet, and I have everything pulled out, but like the oranges and the pinks that feed the ECU that are on all the time, fuel pump relay control wire, and I think the mill light wire, but everything that you see here, including the connectors, is what's left over. Now you can use this, which is the fuel pump or fuel pressure signal. So if you're hooking it back into a GM vehicle, I know I've done it on an S10, if it matches, that will show back up on your dash. So it'll read into the instrument cluster. So if you're using stock instrument cluster, keep this connector. For the 4L60Es, if you want to continue using your Prindle switch for the automatic and you have a digital column or a digital dash, you can keep that. So I never really throw any of these connectors away. I just wind them up because some of these are identical connectors with different wire colors. They can be reused if you have a damaged connector. So, of course, I never throw anything away. So these are the two that go to the transmission. But all the rest of this is not used. So these connectors here, I'll just go ahead and cut all the rest of the wires off from those because we're going to never use those connectors, but I'll definitely reuse the wires because they have the ends on them. So if you don't have the terminal ends for the wires, like this, you can reuse these wires and solder them in, but otherwise you've got to buy the tool and everything else to put them together. But if you don't have that, you can reuse these wires. These are the grounds that go to the red and blue connectors, or red and green if it's 2000 and above, that are the grounds for the ECU. So they're usually in 1 and 40 on both of them. And I keep this group, it's all spliced together and everything else. And the biggest reason I do that is because it has two really nice terminal connectors. So what I'll do is I'll plug these in, and I will connect one or two of these, depends on my application, to the back of the engine block where there's a ground. It's on the passenger side back corner. I think it's like a 13mm. But those make really nice grounds because if you remember, a lot of your signals to your sensors are ground switched. So if I ground this right to the block and you do your ground circuit, which we'll talk about in the future when we're doing it on the engine stand or putting it in the car, it's very important for ground. So I keep this and I'll cut it back a little bit more later. So now I've got all the connectors cut off that we're not going to use. So you can see I just cut it back, use as much of the wire as possible, because you never know, you might need that last ½ inch or 2 inch that you cut long. And the last one we got is C1 blue. So the pink wires, if you go back and look at your Excel spreadsheet or whatever you're using, these are switched on. So when you turn the ignition switch to accessory and to run and to start, these are going to be on all the time. So this is what turns on the ECU. Orange wires are the wires that will go to the battery through a fuse, but they should be on all the time. So you should always have 12 volts to these. These are to keep the memory and all the other functions inside the computer. The green wire, I just left it on here. This is your CAN bus signal that eventually gets hooked up to your OBD2 port. So there's what's left. So if you remember about 30 minutes ago in video time, we had a massive harness that General Motors uses throughout their platforms, all about the same size. That one happened to be a truck harness. And this is where we're at now. So as you can see, we have individual harnesses for each sensor or coil pack group, fuel injectors, rail, all that is individually packaged now. So this looks a lot less intimidating than what we started with. So each one of them is now coiled up by themselves. So what I do is I take each one off and wire it and check everything out. I'll hang it on a peg on a pegboard. So by engine, so engine 1, engine 2, whoever they're for, I hang those up there. So when I'm ready to go back and do that one, I can either pull it off for that particular motor or say, oh, this motor was drive-by cable, now I want it to make it a drive-by-wire. So I'll just go pull a drive-by-wire one. So everything is right here. Makes things a lot easier, it's a lot less intimidating for people, and I think it will help you out in the long run. So hopefully this works for you. We'll show you more. So this is a preview for part 2.
So this motor is the next one we're going to build. It is a 191,000 mile motor that came out of a 2003 Escalade. I drove this truck into my shop and disassembled it, so I know the motor's good, but I'm still going to go through the same procedure that I use to make sure that this is good. So I have pretty much stripped it of everything that's we're either not going to need or that I do stuff on, but I'm not going to go much farther than this, because what I want to do is I want to check compression and I also want to check oil pressure, because if I don't have those two or there's a problem, I can either pull the valve covers off and see if I've got a sticky valve, which I've had before, or there's some more terminal issues with the motor. I'm not going to go any farther with it. I'm not going to put any money into it. So this is just kind of a preview of where we're going for part 2.